18, 18 Le Petit Prince, 16 Spitfire, 12, 10, 9. This is a very rare spread. It might not look like much, but I can tell you that there aren't many rooms in the world that have these watches in them, and as far as I know, there are 0 videos. This video is only possible because of my man at Time Titans, who has several of these listed for sale. Link below. The IWC Mark series is one of the brand's most celebrated lines and helped make IWC what it is today, which is a powerhouse of Swiss watchmaking. And personally, the more I learn about IWC, the more I appreciate it. These watches are a prime example of that. When I bought my IWC Mark 18, I had a vague idea that there was some military and aviation history to the Marks. Germany, the British military, the Dirty Dozen?
You must be out of your mind. It might seem that way.
Wait, that can't be right. This is my first time seeing some of this history up close. Seeing, feeling, and wearing. And so I'm digging in to learn more. Let's fly. It all began in 1936 with this watch, the IWC Mark 9. Of course, it wasn't called the Mark 9 at the time. IWC referred to this watch as the Spezialuhr für Flieger, special watch for pilots. Despite the name and what I had previously thought, this watch was not commissioned for any military. Instead, this was a standard production watch designed for pilots but not specially assigned to them. The Arabic numerals on the Mark 9's dial are about the only stylistic element that can be traced through the entire series. This is the only Mark that uses cathedral hands and the only Mark to have a rotating timing bezel. It uses this lume triangle under the crystal. The watch is about 37mm across and 13mm thick. Inside the Mark 9 is the manually wound IWC caliber 83. The watch is a relatively large size for its era, which makes it quite wearable by today's standards. A person could make this their daily driver, but personally, I'd be exceedingly careful if I owned this Mark 9.
It belongs in a museum.
It's this next watch, the Mark 10, that gave the Mark 9 its posthumous name. In 1944, the British Armed Forces commissioned 12 companies to make watches according to the stringent requirement set by the Ministry of Defense. 12 manufacturers, 12 watches, a dozen, also known as the Dirty Dozen. Out of the 150,000 Dirty Dozen watches made, only 6,000 were this Mark 10. The 10 is smaller than the Mark 9 by 2mm, so 35mm across, though it's also powered by the IWC caliber 83. Here we start to see a transition to a more modern IWC Mark. The small seconds hand is still present, but the hands are now pencil style. The numerals have been updated to a more modern, cleaner font, and now the branding simply reads IWC rather than International Watch Company. Both the dial and the caseback feature military markings. The broad arrow symbol is on the dial just below the IWC logo, and it's also on the back, along with WWW, which the British Army used to label this watch as Watch, Wrist, Waterproof. In 1948, the Mark 10 was replaced by the Mark 11. The 11 had a very long run. IWC made these watches for the Royal Air Force only until 1953, but continued to sell them to the public for years. The British military didn't decommission the Mark 11 until 1981. Inside the 11 was a different movement, the IWC caliber 89. The 89 was made to be more robust than the 83 and allowed the Mark 11 to be the first Mark with a central seconds hand. The 89 was so successful that IWC continued to produce it for 30 years. Then from 1981 until 1993, there was a gap in the IWC Mark series. A lot had changed in the industry and at IWC. Maybe the gap was the manufacturer figuring its shit out. Whatever the reason, I think the wait was worth it. In 1993, IWC released this Mark 12. Though the 12 looks very similar to the 11, this is the first modern IWC Mark. You might even say that it's the first luxury Mark also. Like the 11, the 12 is 36mm in diameter, uses pencil hands, and has a large crown. The 12 also added a date complication, which I think shows that this was produced not for the military but for the general public. The 12 was also the first Mark to be offered on a bracelet. It's a really nice mesh style with fitted end links and a butterfly deployant clasp. Even in the early 90s, IWC was making some of the best bracelets in Switzerland. Inside the Mark 12 is the IWC caliber 884, which is based on the Jaeger-LeCoultre 889/2. The Mark 12 was the last Mark which used a non-ETA or non-Solita movement. It also continued the use of the pencil hands, which would later be swapped out in favor for the German Flieger-style hands on the Mark 16. You can see those hands on this 39mm Mark 16 Spitfire. The Spitfire series from around 2008 can be identified by its applied numerals and applied markers, and the stepped dial. The Spitfire aesthetic was a bit of a departure from the austere Mark series. More texture, sunburst treatment on the dial, and most obviously on this example, a silver dial. This one also features the subtle and elegant lug bevel that you can find on most Marks made today, like my very own Mark 18. This is the current generation of IWC Mark watches. This is the standard black dial version, and this is the blue dial Le Petit Prince reference. They're both 40mm across, 11mm thick, and 50mm long. In addition to the dial color difference, the Le Petit Prince also has polished hands, a white date wheel, and a polished bezel rather than the brush bezel on my standard 18. The Mark 18 came out in January 2016, and despite a lot of new references since then, the 18 continues to be a core watch for IWC. I assume there's going to be a replacement sometime. In fact, I thought that was the purpose of the 39mm in-house Spitfire, which came out in 2019. But the two watches seem to be happily cohabitating in the IWC catalog. I went in-depth on the Mark 18 when I bought it last year, so you can watch that video to learn more. It's an ideal daily watch, versatile and elegant. I highly recommend it. Seeing all these Marks together is a nerdy thrill. I don't think I've ever had the opportunity to handle this many generations of a single line of watches, let alone one so revered. Each of these is interesting in its own way and tells its own story. I gotta say though, I do have a favorite of the bunch. The 1993 Mark 12. Now I'm not saying it's better than the others. It doesn't have the history of the 9 or 10, and it doesn't have the modern refinement of the 16 or 18s. But I like the 36mm size. I like the pencil hands. I really like this bracelet. And the JLC movement also adds some interest. Whichever you like or shit, even if you hate these, I hope this video has helped you appreciate the Mark series. It's helped me. For me, one of the attractions of watches is the opportunity to study history. Watches are anachronistic. They're from a different time. We don't actually need them anymore. But they remind us of the past. And we love watches, not despite their stories, but because of them.